Tax season is rolling around.
You probably should get those filed.
But, you know, every tax season, there's always somebody who's going to spend that $4,500 check on a Nissan Altima, on a Dodge Charger from like 2006, or a Chevy Malibu. And the Chevy Malibu at its inception was top tier, baby. I mean, that was the top trim for the Chevelle. But over time, at some point, it became the rental mobile. And in this video, I wanted to talk about when in the did the Chevy Malibu become stuck in rental hell purgatory. What's up, guys? My name is Chris, and welcome to The Breakdown, where we talk about everything cars, news, and reviews. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're not, as always, welcome back. So I did a poll because I'm trying to catch up. I'm a little backlogged here. But I did a poll, and the thing that I really wanted to talk about was subcompacts, as well as the Chevy Malibu being in rental purgatory hell. So, like I said before, the Chevy Malibu back in the day was top tier, babes. If you wanted a Malibu, that was the end all be all of the Chevelle. And somewhere between its discontinuation towards the late 70s, early 80s, and in between the reintroduction around 1997, there was a shift in the Chevy Malibu. And I wanted to talk about that because the Chevy Malibu was recently discontinued, and it was a big deal for the car community, which I never really got a chance to talk about. And in this video, we'll be exploring a few things. It won't be so data heavy. I try to not do that because you guys can probably get bored with a lot of those numbers. If you do want me to keep those, feel free to let me know in the comments. But I wanted to talk about the Chevy Malibu and what happened with the Chevy Malibu in terms of how it used to be at the top of the top and then just shifted. And it's really not exactly what we think it is, and it really happens in a particular generation, and I'll be talking about that. So in this video, not only will we be talking about the Chevy Malibu and what it once was, but also the transition from being top tier status to being a tax season special. With that being said, stick around and stay tuned because you are now watching The Breakdown. So, like I said, I won't go too data heavy into this. Sometimes it's really tough to kind of get the nooks and crannies, but I'll do my best. So the Chevy Malibu used to be top tier in the sense of it was a top tier trim level for the Chevelle. And during this time, General Motors is on the top next to Ford and even Dodge and Chrysler. And the Chevelle was a pretty moderate sized car, and it was big, it was bold, and the Malibu was like everything that you could think of. And because it was so stylish and practical, it wasn't quite the Impala, but it gave Impala presence, if you will. And throughout time, over the next few generations, it slowly became a mainstay. One of the biggest selling points about the Malibu was that it was affordably priced and really had became a mainstay for its practicality and daring, if you will. And the Malibu has never been daring, but it's always been top tier trim. And between 1964 and 1983, there was like a slow, steady demise. Now, I've talked about this before. The gas crisis of 1973 is really where we begin to shift things. And the earlier Malibus were rear-wheel drive, and rear-wheel drive is a big deal because back then car culture was very different, and it was very much we had just coming off the heels of the hot rod era. So the Malibu, alongside the Mustang and, you know, the Galaxy and all these other different cars that were out there, big body V8 V6 rear wheel drive, and I think this one had a inline six, and it was big, it was bold, and General Motors really were doing their thing. But as I said before, with the gas crisis of 1973, things begin to shift, and slowly but surely the Chevelle nameplate was discontinued and the Malibu was left in the mid 70s. And what this really shows us is how impactful this is, because this is the first time we veer away from the fire breathing V8s that General Motors used to use, and then they start to downsize. And so this is where we see our first change of the Malibu, and that is because this is also the Malaise era, and it was replaced by the Celebrity. Y'all know I love the Celebrity. I don't like the car, but I like the car. Don't ask me why. But the Celebrity is what eventually replaced the Malibu. Now, I don't know if General Motors went back and said we made a mistake, or if consumer demand or research, I don't know what happened. I hadn't really looked into it. But the Malibu went through a few changes, and going from a premium nameplate to becoming the mainstay, and then dropping the Chevelle plate, and then going to just a regular Malibu, and then being replaced by the Celebrity is just a dynamic shift in what it was in this fall from grace. Now, I've talked about this in many, many dimensions. American cars lost their legacy after we as an industry were forced to go to smaller cars. We weren't forced to go to efficient cars as much as we were smaller cars, because you could still put a mild, moderate size engine and performance in a car and still get the fuel economy. But I think at that point, most car companies were just trying to stay afloat, because many of them were either going bankrupt or losing huge profitability. In fact, when they got rid of the Malibu around the 80s, is actually when Ford came out with the Taurus and really shook the whole industry once again. So you see these ebbs and flows with the American car industry. But towards the mid to late 90s, General Motors decides it is time to bring the Malibu nameplate back. And they bring it back 1997 with the reintroduction of the Malibu. Now, this one sticks in my head as a quintessential 90s car. No other car that I have seen reminds me of stock images from Adobe Photos. And the Malibu got a lot of praise from Motor Trend and was in fact car of the year for 1997, even though Car and Driver pretty much grilled it and said, what the were y'all on? Because the plastics were bad, the driving dynamics were bad. You could get 3.1 with the 155 horsepower, or you could get the 4-cylinder. But when it first got reintroduced, there was something different about this Malibu. And the thing that was really different about this Malibu was that it was front wheel drive. Now, that didn't stop consumers from buying it, because there were a lot of people who had said, I just bought this Malibu because I had my old one and I just wanted another Malibu. And we've seen this before with a few other cars where they brought nameplates back. And this also ties into my idea of why car companies have to stop relying off nostalgia and just do something very different, because nostalgia can be a really dangerous thing for cars in particular, because you can really tarnish the legacy of a car and get straight hate from your consumers, especially enthusiasts. I will say this confidently with my whole chest that we a little toxic. And the rear wheel drive shift, no pun intended, to front wheel drive is really where we start to see the first sign that this is going in a different direction. I can't forget that there also was the Chevy Classic in between that time of 1997 and 2004. And that was one of the first vehicles that was really fleeted out as a rental car lineup. Now, I do not want this to be disillusioned. General Motors and Ford have been doing rental car fleets for a very long time. And even so much so that Ford was one of the first car companies to really build a vehicle around rental cars. Because it used to be that they were never actually designed for rental car fleets, but since the 80s, they were starting to be more engineered and designed around the idea of fleets. And fleets isn't just rentals, it's also cops, it's also government vehicles. And so a lot of the cars and costs that went along with engineering were centered in mind with fleet sales. And around 1997 for Ford in particular, and the Taurus was really when we began to see more cars start to focus their efforts around fleeting. But that doesn't change the idea that the Malibu has also shifted in the big body that it was to now being more centered around fleets. Now back to 2004, this is truly, honestly, truly the first time that we see the Malibu be almost engineered and designed with fleets in mind. The plastics were awful. Now, granted, you could get it in several different trims, and one of my favorite trims that I think didn't get enough love was the LT Max. And it was a wagon, and it looked awful on the inside, but it was something about getting a Malibu wagon, and I just love that rear, especially that straight bar that just goes right across it. And it was also front wheel drive, but it is considered to be one of the worst models of the Malibu in history. And when you get in it, it's just sparse, and a lot of the tech features and plastics were very much just, they slapped in there. Now, this also was a time where General Motors was really struggling to make things work. And so this is also coming on the heels of the housing crisis of 2008. And so we see between General Motors and Chrysler that they are going down, babes. I will say that this also was Chrysler's moment, because around this time they had the Sebring, which was the competitor, and Ford had. And I think the real reason why the car was engineered with fleets in mind is because General Motors was trying to save money. The Malibu around this time for this generation was definitely, I want to say this was the 7th generation, definitely the rental mobile. Now, we've seen this before, but 2008 is when the new generation comes in. And this was met with half and half criticisms. Part of it is because the Malibu was so cheap. And I don't mean that just quality wise, I mean that it was cheap to build, because this is around the time when General Motors gets more money from the government in an effort to rehabilitate themselves as a way of the buyout around 2008, 2009. Now, keep in mind that a lot of these cars are developed 4 and 5 years prior to their release. So if it was released in 2008, it probably started being developed around 2003. And the problem with this vehicle was that it was bland styling, but it was designed to compete with the Fusion, which at the time was totally kicking ass, and the Corolla and the Camry, which the original 1997 Malibu competed with very well. Now, that doesn't go without saying that the Malibu has always been an affordable vehicle. Like I said, going back to the early 60s, it has always been a affordable, practical vehicle. But slowly but surely, General Motors has started to show their cheapness. And like I said, this is around the time of the bailout. So this moment is really when we begin to see General Motors starting to tighten up. But being that these cars are engineered with rental corporate fleets in mind, it started to show. And as many Americans struggle to afford Camrys, and because I don't think I remember them Camrys and them Accords, even Mazda 6s were kind of pricey back then. And given that we're in a huge recession, a lot of people could not afford these expensive cars, and a lot of them actually got halted for production. And I want to say this much, is that corporate fleets make up a huge percentage of American vehicle sales, and so it is in their best investment to make sure that they consider engineering these cars in mind. But because these cars are so centered around corporate fleets, that also means there's a large production produced. And ever since the 80s, the American car companies couldn't really get off their overproduction, and it was very wasteful. And because of that, a lot of them flood these rental car companies with these cars. Now, and the difference between this car versus many of the other American car companies is that the Malibu was one of the last sedans. As we know nowadays, Ford doesn't really make a sedan anymore. And Chrysler, if it's not a Charger, Chrysler doesn't make a vehicle anymore. And and if we really think about it, a lot of the car companies now don't really make sedans anymore, even prior to the discontinuation of the Malibu. Ford stopped making sedans back in 2018. Chrysler, if it's not a Dodge Charger, there is no sedan, because Chrysler doesn't make anything outside of the Pacific. And so the last man standing, especially after the discontinuation and the complete fleeting out of the Impala, was the Malibu. And for the next generation of Malibu, which was roughly around 2015, 2016, we start to see the shift from Malibu to rental car. And it was already that way from the 2004 version, but now it really is like the rental car. And so this is really how the Malibu went from a premium trim to being stuck in rental car purgatory, and thus becoming a tax season special. So now that I have gone through all that, feel free to leave me a comment below and let me know what you think about the Chevy Malibu. If you think that's what happened, or if you have some other insights on how it went from being top tier to being a rental car. And with that being said, until the next video, I will see you guys later.